My name is Jessica Sandoval, and I am the National Campaign Strategist with the Unlock the Box campaign, a 10-year campaign to end solitary confinement in the U.S. jails and prisons, and bringing the U.S. into full compliance with the Nelson Mandela rules. Today I'm going to moderate this session, and I've really designed the panel with the intention of bringing some local context to an international conference and the issue of solitary confinement. You'll have the opportunity today to hear from local experts who've seen the harmful effects of mass incarceration and solitary confinement. We're eager to share our experiences with you today. I'd like to introduce our other panelists. Shannon Battle is a native Washingtonian, go Nats, who is recently home after a 25-year sentence. He spent over 3 years in solitary confinement in 2 federal facilities and the DC jail. Shannon is currently a poet ambassador for the local reentry organization here in DC called Free Minds Book Club and Writing Workshop. Vishal Agraharkar joined the ACLU of Virginia as a senior staff attorney in March of 2018. He advocates on a broad range of issues to advance civil rights and civil liberties in Virginia, including through impact litigation, non-litigation advocacy, and educating individuals and communities across Virginia. Today we're going to ask you to imagine what it's like to be in solitary confinement, if only for the hour that we're here together. Let's take this journey. I'm going to start a short video that's about 5 minutes, provide some context around solitary, and then I'm going to moderate a conversation between the three of us through a series of questions. If you want to sit
in July 2013, 30,000 state prisoners went on hunger strike in California. The strike lasted for 2 months. It was the second one since 2011. The prisoners were protesting solitary confinement, what many people consider to be a form of torture. In solitary, your world is a gray concrete box. You spend between 22 and 24 hours a day alone in your cell. Your bed is a concrete slab with a thin mattress. 3 times a week, guards shackle you and take you to the showers for 15 minutes. For exercise, you pace around another concrete box. Sometimes a bit of ceiling is uncovered. This is the only time you'll see the sky. As a punishment, the use of solitary confinement is often an arbitrary decision. Nearly 3,000 people are held in Pelican Bay State Prison in Crescent City, California. Over a third are in solitary, most of them because of quote-unquote gang affiliation. But that's a meaningless phrase. Gang affiliation might mean reading a book by a Black Panther, or drawing Aztec patterns, or even having a tattoo. But Pelican Bay isn't alone in this. Around the country, you can land in solitary for your art, your reading, your beliefs, your gender status, your sexual orientation, or your friends. Women have ended up in solitary after reporting being raped by guards. Transgender prisoners are often put in solitary just for being trans. Prisons say this is for their protection. There is no limit to how long someone can be held in solitary confinement, and very little evidence is needed to justify holding a person in solitary indefinitely. At Pelican Bay, hundreds of people have spent over a decade inside. According to the UN, 15 days in solitary confinement is torture that can cause permanent psychological damage. William Blake, who's been in solitary in a prison in New York State since 1988, said, "Dying couldn't take but a short time if you or the state were to kill me. In SHU, I have died 1,000 internal deaths." Solitary also enables abuse. The Dallas Six were inmates in Luzerne County. In 2009, they contacted human rights groups to complain about torture by guards. According to the Six, in the privacy of solitary, guards would starve prisoners, beat them, and strap them to restraint chairs for up to 18 hours at a time. In April 2010, guards beat and restrained a fellow prisoner. The Six covered their cell windows to draw the attention of a superior. In response, guards beat them bloody, and the prison charged them with rioting. The prison didn't explain how people can riot if they're locked alone in their cells. According to a lawyer for the Center for Constitutional Rights, prisoners in solitary are never granted parole. Because of this, a person sentenced to between 5 and 20 years can often spend the full 20 incarcerated. Prisoners' best hope for staying out of prison after release is maintaining bonds with loved ones while they're inside. But solitary destroys families. Those in solitary aren't even allowed contact visits. It was only after going on a brutal hunger strike that Pelican Bay inmate Gabriel Reyes got to hug his daughters. It had been 18 years. Many prisons even ban phone calls for those in solitary confinement. Personal letters may never be delivered. Books may be taken or withheld. This past November, U.S. officials told United Nations Committee that, quote, there is no systematic use of solitary confinement in the United States. But as of 2013, this country was holding over 80,000 people in solitary confinement, some of whom were only 14 years old. Because of press and protests, there have been tiny reforms. Pelican Bay is reviewing the prisoners isolated because of gang affiliation. In September 2014, a memo by New York City's Correction Commissioner Joseph Ponte promised that Rikers Island would stop locking teens in solitary by the end of the year. But it's not enough. 80,000 humans remain alone in concrete boxes. When will they be out?
I'm going to start with Shannon. Shannon, as a person who has personally experienced solitary, why do people call it torture?
They call it torture because in solitary confinement, you can be alone, and there are a lot of things that happen in segregation that are unknown to society. Like in that film, there's abuse, there's physical abuse, there's mental abuse, and it never reaches society because the way the system is set up, male going in and going out have to go through staff. So if you're being abused and you're trying to reach your lawyer, you don't have access to a phone, or you have access to mail and writing people, but they screen your mail. So if they screening your mail, and they'll flag it if they see something going out that's like against the institution.
The video also mentions dying 1,000 deaths. I've heard people describe it as hell on earth. What exactly is solitary? Can you give us like a description, a flavor, how it looks, what it smells like, the sounds?
You in an 8x10 cell, usually by yourself, and it can be lonely, and it's unsanitary, because in most institutions you have limited access to like sanitation, like cleaning supplies and things of that nature, and on a daily basis, in some institutions you don't get a chance to shower or clean yourself or actually change your clothes. You don't get to change your bed linens, and you just there. Some institutions you're not allowed, they don't give you your property, although you are allowed your property. It's abuse of power, and a lot of things that policy says that the institution is supposed to do, they don't do it. So you in a cell by yourself, and it can get lonely. You know what I'm saying? And it can be rough, and they don't try to help you in no way. So you are there, you're struggling, you're discouraged because you're not getting no mail, or you're not receiving or getting no phone calls or nothing. So it could be really, really tough on anybody in that position. But as a kid, as a juvenile in the system, because I think that's what this is about, it can really be tough psychologically on someone young. I came in at 18 years old. I probably went to segregation at 18 years old, and sometimes they'll put you in a cell with someone. So as a kid, you're immature, so your physical stature, your mental stature you're immature. So they subjecting you to everything from assault to rape, and they are inconsiderate of this when you are like incarcerated, and depending on, you know what I'm saying, where you at, they just throw you in the cell with anybody.
So I mentioned in your bio that you were in 2 federal facilities, and people might be wondering why federal facility and not a state facility. I don't know how many people are in here are from DC, but DC doesn't have a prison system. So people who are charged are at the DC jail, and so all of the convicted folks go to the Bureau of Prisons, which is the federal system, and they can be placed anywhere in the United States. So there's no consideration about being close to home or near a friend, family members. And so I think you were in how many federal facilities? 2?
Yeah, I started at the jail, then I went to the state prison, which is Lawton, which they closed down.
Right.
Then they initially sent us to private prison, and then in 2001 I went to the feds. So I was altogether, I probably was in 10 different institutions, you know, and I probably was locked down in 2 or 3, if not more, institutions. I did 18 month stints in lockdown. I did 15 months altogether, accumulation of probably over 5 years of segregation throughout the 25 years of my incarceration. Like I started from probably 18 years old all the way to I probably was maybe in my mid to mid 30s, you know, because over the years you learn it'd be tough. So over the years I try to, you know, stay out of the way, stay out of trouble, so I don't go to segregation, because I understand when you go to segregation, you lose a whole lot of things. You know, you lose property, you lose contact with your family, and like I say, it's a form of torture, and you're being abused by police, you know, and you can be abused by other prisoners. I mean, that's just a way of life behind the wall.
So Vishal, as an attorney who's represented people who have been subjected to solitary confinement, what kinds of conditions have you personally witnessed as you've been in Red Onion State Prison here in Virginia and potentially other places? And then maybe talk about your recent legal win in providing some context to your access to those places.
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of what you said, Shannon, is very consistent with a lot of what I've heard. So at the ACLU of Virginia, we get we represent people around Virginia, and we get a lot of intakes from a lot of people. About maybe 60% or so of the intakes that we receive, even though we cover all kinds of issues related to civil liberties and civil rights, more than half are from people in prison or jails around Virginia. And so the rules are somewhat different in different places. I mean, there's the Department of Corrections, which manages all of the correctional facilities, the prisons in Virginia, but then there are jails all around Virginia that each one of which has a different set of rules. And so it can be overwhelming to try to every one of those institutions might do segregation a little bit differently, and there isn't necessarily a centralized set of rules. There aren't laws on the books in Virginia that prescribe exactly how segregation units have to be run, who can be put in for how long, and so it's kind of left to the individual jail and warden to figure out their policies, and a lot of the oversight is really through lawsuits. Now, it's really, really hard to bring lawsuits if you're incarcerated. Especially after the 1990s, there was this law that was passed, the Prison Litigation Reform Act, that basically made it extremely difficult for incarcerated people to file lawsuits about their conditions of confinement. It also makes it really hard for them to find attorneys who will represent them, because it drastically cut the amount of, and made it really difficult to recover fees, which is one of the ways that usually in this country incentivize people to bring lawsuits by allowing lawyers to recover a certain number of fees. And there's strict limits when you're suing a prison as opposed to any other official. So in terms of the actual conditions we've seen, and we released a report in 2018 called Silent Injustice, and it kind of compiled a lot of what we had been hearing, but they're very consistent. I mean, there are a lot of different ways that solitary or segregation or restrictive housing or whatever you want to call it, those units are run, but there's some common factors as well. So basically, you are in generally a small confined space, usually no bigger than a parking space for the vast majority of the day, with extremely restricted privileges and extreme isolation and sensory deprivation. And then it affects things like how many showers you can get per week, how many visitors you can have per month, how many books you're allowed to take out, if any, how many telephone calls you can make, what kind of, for example, at Red Onion, which is where we have a couple of lawsuits right now. Red Onion State Prison is all the way out in deep Southwest Virginia. I was actually just there a couple nights ago, and it's an 8-hour drive for me. It's really, really hard to get to. It's all the way out right by the Tennessee-Kentucky border, and that's where the Virginia Department of Corrections keep most of their long-term restrictive housing, people who are in long-term restrictive housing. And so it can be really hard for those people to get visits from their family members because very few people live out there. It's just on the side of these old coal mines that basically went defunct, and it's kind of the jobs program of that area now. That prison and the other supermax in Virginia is called Wallens Ridge State Prison, which is very close to Red Onion. So that also kind of goes to how the isolation, because you also can't really get any visits. So it's really hard for people to travel all the way out there. So in terms of some of the lawsuits that we have, we have one on behalf of a man, Mr. Nicholas Reyes, who was in long-term restrictive housing, solitary confinement for about 13 years. All of the conditions I just described, he was, for the vast majority of that, he was in the lowest level of privileges, or the most restrictive form of solitary confinement, where you really are, you have to eat your meals that you get through a slot, so you never really get to go out. You have basically no congregate recreation with other people, and when you are taken out, if you're taken out according to policies, which, as you mentioned, often doesn't happen. The policies themselves, we've learned, are often not followed and not adequately documented, so the only way we learn is through intakes that are coming in. But if they're following policies, that he would be taken out into an outdoor cage where he's by himself, and there's no pull-up bar or anything like that. It's just all you can do there is pace back and forth, but you're outdoors, but that social isolation is still there, and you never were able to touch another human being for 13 years, other than maybe when your handcuffs are put on you through the slot. So in his case, one of the things that was just extremely shocking, everything else is shocking too, but one thing that was, I think, in some ways even more shocking was that the reasons for why he was in there was no real legitimate justification in terms of safety or anything like that. The stated reason for why he was in there was essentially that he couldn't pass or graduate from this program that is purportedly one of their reform efforts, called the step-down program. And every time he had a review, it said, well, he can't pass a step-down program. What we learned, and one of the reasons we brought a suit particularly on his behalf, is because the step-down program was only in English. He didn't speak English. He couldn't read or write in any language. And so he basically was kept in solitary, and these are allegations, and we've just recently survived a motion to dismiss, and it's still ongoing, but that essentially he's being kept in solitary because he can't speak English. And for 13 years. And so I'll just kind of stop there.
We can cover that.
Yeah.
So people might be wondering, like, okay, is solitary reserved for the worst of the worst? Because that is the narrative. That's the what we definitely believe is the myth. And my office, the National Prison Project, kind of took on a project on the listserv that we operate, and we asked the question, what have been the reasons why yourself or one of your clients or somebody you know of was placed in solitary confinement? And we got a host of responses back. And, I think people are always shocked to find out that it is actually about 76% of people in solitary are there for very minor infractions, for not following an order, like not standing for a count, or having what they would call contraband, which would be something. Oh, I have the microphone. He's looking at me. Oh, okay. Things like having too many stamps in your cell or too many envelopes, sewing on belt loops onto your state-issued pants. These are the reasons why people end up in solitary. It's very few, 5% or less, of people who are actually being held in solitary for quote-unquote safety issues or violence. I'm curious if that's been your experience in solitary. Are they mostly minor infractions?
Yes. For the most part, it varies, like you say. It can be from, like you say, not standing up for count, or, I've seen in instances where correctional officers just lock guys up for nothing, because no matter if you right, you wrong in the system, and due to the buddy system, you know what I'm saying, even if you voice what's going on to their superiors, they still agree with their peer over you. So even when you right, you wrong. So you can get locked down from, like you say, anywhere from not standing up for count, walking down. You can be just walking down the walk.
Having an extra orange.
Extra orange. You walking down the walk, and they say you in the wrong place, and you telling them, yeah, I'm supposed to be here, and they telling you, no, you don't supposed to be here, and you can justify your reason for being here, and just because they don't see that you right, you know what I'm saying, or they think they right, they lock you up and put you in confinement for no particular reason, and you usually lose. So you can go to the hole anywhere from a day to 6 months for, minor infractions, something that you should be let out segregation in 24 hours, all because of the policy and how they run. Because you're supposed to see what is called, in SHU they call it DHO in the feds. So they have a policy where they supposed to bring you your disciplinary shot within 24 hours. And they supposed to, you know what I'm saying, and then within 72 hours, you're supposed to see somebody. But in the feds, you liable to go, and once they put you in the cell, you liable to don't see nobody within 24 hours. You liable to don't see nobody within a week. So for something that's minor as, as not standing up for count, you'll wind up staying in segregation for months. For months on it, for nothing. And it's nothing really you can do about it. Like, if you challenge the system, they say you rebelling. They try to lie and say you ride. They make up all type of stories that we really can't refute because it's their story against our story. And our story is always wrong.
I think there's, a very key issue here around solitary and mass incarceration, and we know that undoubtedly that, our prison system is disproportionately
there's racial disparities, and I'm curious about whether or not the same applies to solitary. Do we see more people of color in solitary, going to solitary because of the racial makeup of who's in prison? Or is it, like the movie said, a gang affiliation, so they're segregated because of race or gangs? Is there a racial dynamic to solitary?
Yeah, there's a racial dynamic. Like you have gangs, so so there is a racial dynamic, and there are stereotypes. Like, I'm a DC prisoner. I was a DC prisoner anyway, and in the feds, it's like you got 3 strikes against you. Like, for me, 1 is because my crime, I'm convicted felon. 2, I'm black. And 3, because I was from DC. So they stereotyped us immediately. They stigmatized us. They named us DC blacks. I used to have like conversations with staff telling them I'm not a DC black. I never been a part of a gang my whole life. But y'all continue to call me DC black. Y'all keep stigmatizing me and try to group us as one when we not. We see ourselves as individuals. And there are racial dynamics. And I have actually seen, like, at one point, like coming out of the child hall, and they shake you down. If you get caught with food, they send you to the shoe. So me and the buddy, we noticed this. I mean, this is a regular occurrence, like, because in most of these institutions, there are white correctional officers, and they'll let all the white inmates pass. I'm talking about, don't never say nothing to them, don't never shake them down or nothing. They only grab black guys, or Mexican guys, or Spanish guys. I'm talking about, this is a regular thing. And we sit down, and he showed me one time. He said, "Man, look at this, man." And the white guys can come out with everything. You know what I'm saying? We ain't got nothing, and they grabs us. So it is a dynamic, and it's a stereotype that you experience on a daily basis.
So the research tells us, and has been widely proven, that solitary confinement is especially devastating for people with mental illness. It's tragically terrible for people coming in to a prison setting that don't have mental illness, and it's even worse for those who do. As traumatic as the experience is, for individuals without unique mental health care needs, this idea of solitary confinement kind of compounds and exacerbates the effects of both mental and physical illness. Are people with mental illnesses put in solitary confinement? Is that a routine practice?
They don't discriminate. I done actually seen, like, instances where I'd be like, why are you putting that individual in confinement? And it's like, sometimes, like, because people with mental illnesses, they can be, like, to them, irritable, and they can see that they have mental illness, but they still put them in segregation and put them around people, or put them in a cell with someone, knowing that can cause a conflict. You had this individual that have mental issues, and you put them in a cell with someone that's already isolated and probably frustrated because of his circumstances. So it's going to automatically be a conflict. And this individual with the mental illness, the illness might prevent him from really protecting himself, or making him kind of like privy to like, not just peer pressure, but influence. You know what I'm saying? So it'd be totally wrong. I done seen them put handicapped people in the shoe, like, for no reason, because they could, and that's why it's sad, because you see it on a daily basis. They do stuff. The correctional officers, they just do stuff because they could, with no consideration. You know what I'm saying? Only time you might see consideration is that racial dynamic you talked about earlier. If it's because most of these correctional officers, they are white. You know what I'm saying? And they look out for their kind. You know what I'm saying? They won't abuse their kind. You see that. But like, in regards to, it's correctional officers that's black, but the black correctional officers, they ain't gonna, they don't, for the most part, they treat me harsher than they treat a white guy. So I mean, you know, it is an everyday experience. Go ahead.
I was on a panel or helped facilitate a panel for a congressional briefing about disabilities and solitary confinement, and we had a deaf man who was in a Maryland prison who was in solitary because he disobeyed an order. But essentially what happened was corrections officer was screaming or yelling orders from behind, and he's deaf, and so he couldn't hear, and so they took that as a disobedience and charged him and put him in solitary. And he wasn't given assistance to be able to use any kind of closed captioning or TTY phones, and lots of abuses. And I'm saying that because there may be hearing impaired or deaf people in the audience that, I think this is another example of disabilities where almost it's, if you have a disability of some sort, almost it is a sentence to put you into solitary. Vishal, I know you have kind of seen the effects of solitary, in Virginia, in these state prisons, and I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what the psychological effects of solitary are. It's very well stated in the research, both the psychological and the physiological harms of solitary, but maybe you can talk a little bit about what those are.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think a lot of the points that you were making, those are consistent with what I've seen. That the research shows that, and it's been well documented that solitary confinement can lead to a range of symptoms that can range from things like hypersensitivity to stimuli after you've been kind of deprived of any kind of external stimuli for so long, anxiety, confusion, things like that. And then they can be worse for people who go in with because it's not just people with pre-existing mental health issues who are affected. It both creates and exacerbates a lot of psychological issues. And so, but for people who are already vulnerable, for instance, people with ADD, that sometimes the symptoms can be really severe and can lead to delirium, hallucinatory confusion, and other kinds of symptoms like that. And also there's some studies saying that the longer you're in, the more likely those are to be irreversible and permanent. So even when you're out, it can be hard to actually reverse that. And and I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that there are a lot of the reasons why people go into solitary, even if they are on paper things like disobeying an order or some kind of minor rule violation. They're often really you're going in because of a symptom of mental illness, and and so it creates this kind of cycle where people are more likely to go in when they're displaying certain symptoms. Their mental disabilities will be worsened once you're in. It also makes it a lot harder for you to then reintegrate either into general population settings or into the community if you're being released, especially if you're being released directly from solitary, which makes it more likely that you will recidivate, or you'll be, because of those mental health issues, you might end up back in jail because, unfortunately, in our country, jails and prisons are some of the largest mental health providers by default, and so there's this kind of cycle that gets created, and solitary can be a big part of that.
Yeah, I think your point that you're raising about the fact that people actually get released directly to the community from solitary, I don't think people recognize that actually happens, and that 95% of the people who are incarcerated will return home. And again, being released directly from solitary, I think creates some major public safety challenges. And, you know, I'm curious about how we can kind of address this issue, because what we've seen in some cases is that when people are released directly from a solitary cell, they're put on a bus with their, you know, little bit of money and sent off on their way without any supports. And when I have been in some prisons talking with folks who are kind of in the process of step-down programs or trying to be removed from solitary back into a general population setting, they're terrified of going, because they're like, listen, I've been locked in a box for 7 years, and now you want me to go socialize with people and like be in noisy environments and do all these things, and I don't know how to do that anymore, and I'm afraid. And yet we're, you know, basically sending people on a bus with the public and in very dangerous public safety issues. I was talking with a DOC director who has eliminated long-term solitary in Colorado, who recently retired, and he said, you know, if I were the bus driver on that bus, I would tell everybody to run. Like, it's very dangerous, and he knows from personal experience that it's dangerous. And in that particular case, the reason he got his job was because the DOC director was executed at his doorstep by a man who was just released from solitary confinement. And so I think we're dealing with a host of issues here, and I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts about how that practice can, how we can remove that practice. Is it that we end solitary, or are there other ways that we can encourage these punitive systems to change?
Like, you can end solitary. I mean, that, and also those that's in solitary, or, you know, if they don't end it, there should be more resources. There should be like programs for those guys. Mm-hmm. So when they come out, you know, they can be the transition, the process. They can have some assistance. They can have help. Because I've seen that too, like a guy with mental illness that got released from segregation and he never, as soon as he got to the bus stop, he reoffended. I'm talking about he never even made it past his second bus stop because he had a mental illness, and they knew it because, you know, they seen it on a daily basis. You know, that's what he went to the shoot for, and he, you know what I'm saying, and this was obvious. Y'all know he need help. You know, he need medication, but y'all released this guy to society. Then when he reoffended, people like, man, who's this guy? Why did they let him go? Y'all know he had a mental illness. Y'all didn't give him no help. Y'all didn't care. So he reoffended. You know, some of them probably more comfortable being back in jail, because like you say, it can be scary. Mm-hmm. It can be scary. You just release me to society, probably with no support, and I just don't understand, you know, where to go from there. So they reoffend because that's all they know, and with no help and no resources to help them, I mean, it's going to be a cycle.
Do you have anything to say about that?
No, I agree with that. I guess the only, beyond just kind of ending long-term solitary confinement, I think another thing is that sometimes there are definitely many reports of people who are placed in solitary confinement settings for their own protection, and that can create these same issues, and especially unnecessarily. I mean, there can be protective custody type environments that are not as isolating as solitary confinement. And I think in terms of releasing people back into the community, the way to deal with that is to just stop doing that. I mean, there has to be appropriate transitional phases. People have to be gradually re-socialized, and so it should never be the case that people are released directly from solitary confinement, or even within a short period, just give them a short transition phase, and then out there, it has to be an understanding that that is setting people up to fail.
So I'm going to pivot us from the doom and gloom to the, what are we doing about it, right? So I know that each of us is kind of in our own ways working on either ending the practice or in some other forms mitigating some of the harms that have been done to people in prison. And so I want to give each of us an opportunity to talk about kind of what work is happening around here locally, Virginia, DC, Maryland, and I can also provide a bit of a national context, but it would be great to talk about what Free Minds does and some of the legislative work that you all are doing in Virginia to combat this and make it at least not so negative.
Yeah, I'm a Free Minds ambassador, and Free Minds is a nonprofit, and they focus on like transitioning guys that's coming from prison, but one of their purposes is they focus on guys that reading and writing, and that's what they focus on. They focus on like encouraging guys to read, write poetry, and they give them feedback. And I think like one of their main focuses on guys that's in segregation, because they are alone. You know what I'm saying? They could be discouraged. So they go to these institutions, they visit these guys, and they encourage them to read and write poems, and to send them poems out to society. And we have like write nights and things of that nature where these same poems that these guys write behind the wall in segregation, we have feedback from society at large, not just us. I'm just a poet, ambassador for Free Minds. We have people from everywhere, and we give these guys feedback, and it's been proven that it encourages guys. You have guys that sometimes be in situations where they feel hopeless, and they get these poems or get this feedback from their poems, and it encourages them to be positive. You know what I'm saying? It gives them hope, because it lets them know that there are some people in society that just didn't give up on them, and we got their back. Just continue to strive and try to remain positive and read and just use positive outlets to get by on a daily basis, because sometimes that's what you got to do. You got to take it day by day, especially in solitary confinement, and that's our objective, just to encourage guys and get them a a positive outlet to look forward to.
Yeah, I think that kind of made me think that a lot of it is about ways that we can help give people a voice who are incarcerated, and there are a lot of different ways to do that. People who are incarcerated, they have very little, have very few avenues of having a voice. They, as I mentioned earlier, they don't really have the ability to bring that many successful lawsuits or hire that many attorneys, including through pro bono work. They don't have a vote in all but 2 states. They don't. People who are incarcerated can't. People incarcerated in prison can't vote. And so one of the things actually that we're doing in the ACLU of Virginia is to kind of advocate to guarantee a right to vote to everyone that cannot be taken away. The other thing is that you can get involved in. There are a lot of organizations like yours that work with people who are incarcerated. I know in Virginia there's a coalition of people who work specifically on solitary confinement and frequent communication with people who are in solitary and trying to advocate on their behalf. We have these lawsuits that we're working on. There are a number of attorneys out in Virginia and around the country who who are bringing these lawsuits, including some class actions. We have a class action right now against the Department of Corrections on behalf of people who are in long-term restrictive housing out in those 2 prisons I mentioned earlier. And then, of course, at least in Virginia and in most states, the governor and the legislature both have the ability to create real change on this issue. And increasingly in states, they're taking those steps. So, Jessica, you mentioned Colorado, and that was an initiative that was kind of done through the Department of Corrections itself. Usually, it's not the case that the Department of Corrections of a state is so willing to kind of on their own put in, at least go as far as Colorado did. But the governor often has that authority. So advocacy to governors who often kind of the Department of Corrections fall under their control can help, and then the legislature, of course. And so we are hoping to advocate for a bill next session that will do something similar to what New Jersey did last legislative session, which is essentially to end solitary confinement for certain vulnerable groups, like people with serious mental disabilities and people who are particularly young, the various other vulnerable groups, and then to restrict it for everyone else in accordance with what the UN has been advocating for, which is no more than 15 consecutive days in solitary confinement at a time. So certainly measures like that cannot pass without the public mobilizing behind them. And so that's a way for people to get involved as well.
I think one thing that happened this year that's particularly exciting is there were 28 states who introduced anti-solitary legislation, which tells me that we're at a tipping point in this country to start looking at least and examining ways to either abolish solitary or severely restrict it. And that was a point in time where I feel like, okay, let's see what happens in 2020. Will there be 28 states again, or will there be 33? Or are we going to see 7? But of those 28 states, 8 of them actually passed and signed legislation into law restricting solitary, and in some cases really almost banning it, with the exception of a Mandela-type rule, which is the 15-day. In New Jersey, it's 20 days. So what we're seeing is really removing young people, pregnant women, the LGBT community, the disabled, the seriously mentally ill out of these solitary confinement settings. And so we're pleased and happy that there is actually, it looks like a real tipping point on this issue, which is great, because I personally believe that mass incarceration, solitary, is its handmaiden. Like, you cannot have this 2.2 million people incarcerated in this country without it being efficient. And the efficiencies that are afforded to it are essentially through solitary. And so we're hopeful that the more we restrict and end solitary, we start to see some of these supermax and maximum security prisons unable to operate, because that's essentially what they're built for. So we really see a decarceration strategy there. I know that we're running pretty close to time here, and I just wanted to give either of you a minute or so if there are closing statements that you'd like to make, and then we can open it up to the audience for questions.
I would like to say just thank you for inviting me here and sharing my experience. Thank everybody for coming out. I'm a poet ambassador for Free Minds, and it's always a pleasure for me to come and share my story or give my experience for the betterment of society, because I have friends that's currently incarcerated now, that's subjected to everything we are talking about up here, and they going through it on a daily basis as we speak. And I appreciate it, and I will, continue to fight for the right thing, reform, just throughout the justice system, period. Because we need more resources, we need reform throughout the justice system. Segregation, incarceration. I mean, the correctional system is, it's a lot of things that's going on in that system that's not being told. And this is a platform that's shining a light on that, them issues. And I appreciate being here so I can share my experience.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's it all. I just want to thank you, Shannon and Jessica, and thank all of you for being engaged on this issue.
Yes, I also want to thank you all, and hopefully you have a better understanding about the kind of solitary issue and its role that it plays in mass incarceration and our kind of criminal legal system in general. Obviously, our work continues from here to ensure that we build a future where people are not designated to live their lives out in a 6x9 cell. So thank you for coming out. And we'll open it up for questions.
It's a short question. Could you comment upon whether or not you see systematic differences in public prisons versus privately contracted prisons?
So I think I'll probably just let you answer this, because most of what we see are all there are very few private facilities and there's one private facility that's actually contracted by the Department of Corrections, I believe, but that's about it. So I actually haven't seen real differences.
There aren't real differences in terms of the way isolation is used in private or public institutions, but most of people are housed in public institutions. So that's, I think people like to focus on private institutions because they're traded on the stock market, through stocks and bonds to be able to have a publicly traded market of prisons. And I think that is where, the people like to focus, but really most people are housed in public facilities that are run by the government.
Thanks for being here and for sharing. So this is more of a legal question. So we said that, I think you mentioned there's 28 legislatures that have raised the issue of solitary. It seems like that would be evidence that there's much more data that supports the negative effects of solitary. So as a legal question, do you know if there's attempts to be looking at Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual challenges for 23 hours, that kind of thing, moving forward?
One thing I'll add to that is 23 hours Monday through Friday, 24 hours on the weekends.
And I'll add to that it actually kind of depends, and sometimes I've seen a lot of different kind of configurations of the hours. But yes, the answer is yes. Actually, in both of the cases that we have Eighth Amendment claims that have moved forward. Recently, there was a very good decision in from my perspective, in the Fourth Circuit, which is the federal appellate circuit that covers Virginia and the other states around Virginia, that found that the conditions on death row in the solitary-like conditions in death row, which are very similar to the conditions in solitary generally in the Department of Corrections, was found to violate the Eighth Amendment. So yes, and the Supreme Court has affirmed this previously, and then the question is just whether the conditions in any given solitary confinement, kind of about like how restrictive they are and that kind of thing. But it's not just the Eighth Amendment; it's also it can violate the Due Process Clause as well. In our case, with respect to Mr. Reyes, the individual case that we have claims under the Eighth Amendment, under the Due Process Clause. We also have a claim under the Americans with Disabilities Act that it's not that it does not accommodate his mental disability by putting him in solitary and not moving him out because he's disabled. And we also have an interesting claim there, which you don't see very often in these kinds of cases, which is a national origin discrimination claim. And the idea is that because he essentially is not, because of his inability to speak English, and the way he and other people of Central American origin or other Spanish language speakers and other limited English proficiency speakers are treated generally in this prison, where pretty much all of the COs are white, that actually constitutes national origin discrimination as well. And that claim also succeeded at the motion to dismiss stage.
Any other questions? Craig.
This is not really a question. My name Wendell Watson. I'm a free mind poet bastard. I just came home 6 months ago after doing 22 years and 3 months. I was sentenced to 35 years of life at 17 years old. From the time I was 17 years old, from the time I was 21, I was in solitary confinement. 3 years in Lawton and a year in Red Onion. So, and then for some more years, I was in and out to solitary confinement in the BOP because I was from DC. Then at one time I did 4 years straight in solitary confinement. So that's the second 4 years. So there's 8 years altogether. Not counting the times where I did 6 months, 7 months because somebody got into it from DC that wasn't even on my side, wasn't in my unit. And in the 22 years and 3 months, I only got but 2 write-ups, fugitive direct order and out of bounds. Out of bounds was, I was working in recreation, but I was in the library. So that goes to show you also that people be getting put in solitary confinement for nothing. In my 22 years and 3 months, I might have did probably 13 or 14 years if you put it all together in solitary confinement with these 2 minor write-ups. And like you said earlier, it's hard to turn it back around, because when I went in population, a lot of time when I was in population, because when you in solitary confinement, they play a lot of mind games. They play with the food, they do things, you know what I'm saying? They don't come with direct like they supposed to, and also they leave the lights on. So when I went to the compound, I never turned my lights on no more, because when I was in solitary confinement, they leave the lights on. So I had good guys, my buddies that was my cellies, they'll move out because they know I don't touch the light. You know what I'm saying? Now I've been home for 6 months after doing 22 years, 3 months. I don't turn my light on. You know what I'm saying? I still, when I come in the house, my sister and them be in the living room, I go right to my room and shut my door. Sometimes I come out if I need something. But that's how, like you say, it's like, it's hard to turn things around when you've been living this way so long. And it's like, I'm comfortable with that, but it's an issue. You know what I'm saying? And that's how they affected me as a youngin', 17 years old. Went to prison 17 years old, came home when I was 39. That's just where I want to share that story.
I noticed you have glasses, and I haven't met anybody who's been in solitary that doesn't need glasses, and it's because there's no horizon to look at. You don't get to focus on things that are far away because the cells are so small, and so people become very nearsighted because of those physical constraints. So I think it's another physiological harm of solitary that I witness all the time. One last question before we wrap things up here. Anybody have another question?
I was just wondering, you can think about this too if you want, if we were able to fix the issues with solitary confinement so that people who don't necessarily deserve to be there don't go there, but the people who should, like who do the really awful things, do you think it should still be around for stuff like that? Or do you think that there's just too many issues for it to stay here?
I understand your point, but even if the system was modified to what you say, there's, the correctional officers still find a way to put those that don't belong dead in. So that's why it's better just to alleviate it all together, because they gonna find a way to put those that don't belong in themselves.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, there are ways to ensure safety things without imposing this particular torturous kind of punishment of sensory deprivation that really can destroy people's minds and bodies and things like that. There are ways to ensure safety. There are also other kinds of punishments with respect to your security level points, and like making it potentially like, in Virginia there are 6 different levels of security, of types of security levels that correspond to different prisons, things like that. And when you get a charge, you get points added to your security level that can make it harder for you to get other kinds of privileges and things like that. So that's a system that currently already exists that has nothing to do with solitary. The solitary does not have to be this additional punishment on top of that.
And in regards to what he was just saying, that punitive point system, if like the privilege is getting the TV, or in some institution they let you get like Nintendos or game systems, 9 times out of 10, we want them game systems. You know what I'm saying? We want that, we want those privileges, so it will prevent us from like acting in the wrong manner. So that's the great system. I've seen that work too in other systems.
So it's 12:40, and I promised we would end on time. So thank you all for joining us. We'll stick around for a few minutes if people have questions, individual questions for any of us. Thank you so much.